Hello and welcome into another episode of Lockdown Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk all about the Timberwolves defense from this last year, just kind of a refresh, what they were best at, and also some areas they need to shore up before next year. I know we're nitpicking. It was the league's best defense, but they also lost in 5 games in the conference finals. Where can they improve in the upcoming season? It's all coming on the show. Welcome in. You are Lockdown Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Lockdown Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Lockdown Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. Happy long weekend, Labor Day weekend, of course, here in the U.S. And today we're going to take a step back toward last season. Early in this week, I think Monday's show, we did a bit of an offensive breakdown from this year. We, on Wednesday, went in another direction with some of the Anthony Edwards comments that are out there and did a bit of an offseason reset. And then today I want to get back to the other side of the ball. I want to talk about the defense. Timberwolves had a historically good defense, a generationally good defense this year, truly. And I've talked about that at length before. We'll talk a bit about the numbers today. But I want to get into what they were best at and what they struggled with. And ultimately, the factors that led to, on the defensive side of the ball, a quick, well, not a quick playoff exit, a quick conference finals exit, losing in 5 games to Dallas. So we'll break down the defense here today. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. Of course, you can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. So the Timberwolves last season, just kind of making sure level setting here. Timberwolves were the best defense in the entire league, and it wasn't particularly close. It doesn't matter where you look. They're the best defense. If you look at cleaning the glass, which is which I think is the best place to get some of these numbers, because they take out garbage time, they take out heaves at the end of quarters, that really don't. It can kind of skew those numbers a little bit over the course of a season, right? They add up. So like Basketball Reference, they're still the number one defense. The numbers are slightly different. At cleaning the glass, they gave up only 108.9 points per 100 possessions, which is an incredible number. And the second place team wasn't close to Minnesota. It was Orlando, and they were like 2.6 points behind them. There's only been one other team in the last 30 years, since we have like reliable play-by-play tracking data, that had a greater gap over the next best defense. So that was the 2015-16 San Antonio Spurs, were 3.1 points per 100 possessions better than the second best team. This Minnesota team was better than the 07-08 Boston team in terms of the differential. That Boston team is 2.1 points per 100 possessions better than the second place team. The 2019-20 Milwaukee Bucks were 2.2 points better. And again, the Wolves finished 2.6 points per 100 possessions better than the second best defense in the league. That is, again, by that measure, which is, I don't think that's arbitrary. I think that matters because the context of the rest of the league matters with just how dominant the defense was. And also given the context, the Timberwolves offense was best case a middle of the pack offense, at times languishing in the bottom third of the league in offense this season. The defense carried them to, they were the best team in the West for most of the season and only finished a game out of the number one seed in the West. They finished third in the West and of course went to the conference finals, went further than the top 2 seeds in the Western Conference. So the Timberwolves were carried by their defense, and that gives some context to just how dominant it was. I want to dig into which parts of the defense were most impressive and also the areas that they need to shore up heading into next year. Of course, if you look at the 4 factors, which if you're not familiar with that paints a really obvious picture. And I did a couple shows on this last year during the season. It's something we'll check on periodically because, they're called the 4 factors for a reason. They paint a pretty good picture as to why the best teams on offense and the best teams on defense are the best teams. For like, what are the reasons why? Like, just boil it down to 4 categories. It's not the end all be all, but it paints a pretty good picture. So defensively, Minnesota had the best opponent effective field goal percentage, or the best defensive effective field goal percentage. Opponents' effective field goal percentage was just 51.7%. League average was 55%. Again, the set cleaning the glass. They were number 5 in forcing turnovers, 14.5% turnover rate. League average was 13.7%. Defensive rebound rate, the way cleaning the glass measures it, is opponent's offensive rebound rate, or essentially what percentage of opponent shots did the opponents rebound, and they were 10th in the league there. Free throw rate was middle of the pack, 15th. And actually, if you look at Basketball Reference, which again, there's a little bit more noise there just with the way they pull the data, the Timberwolves actually finished 21st in opponent free throw rate, 15th at cleaning the glass, 21st. And I would imagine that's garbage time, right? That can play into that. That Basketball Reference doesn't filter out. So middle of the pack at best in terms of free throw rate. We're going to get back to a couple of those because that's what I like. Free throw rate and rebounding are going to factor into some of the again, everybody, there's a weakness everywhere. I realize I'm nitpicking. What I just said was a generational defense, which is true, but there's always areas to improve. In terms of where the Timberwolves were best, we can focus on that opponent effective field goal percentage. And I remember early in the season, there were some certainly national podcasts and some folks that were convinced that some of the Timberwolves defense was smoke and mirrors because of opponent 3-point percentage. Like, hey, there's luck involved there, right? Absolutely. There's always luck involved in everything, really, but certainly in defensive numbers and specifically defensive field goal percentage numbers. But there's ways you can drive an opponent field goal percentage down. It's quality of shots that the opponent is attempting, and also what's the level of contest you're getting on those shots. And are you, how is your personnel forcing them into the shots you want them to take? In other words, less corner threes, less shot attempts at the rim. And when they get those shots, can we contest them? Can we make them take tough, contestable mid-range jumpers? Because a wide open mid-range jumper to a really good mid-range jump shooter also isn't great. Like, what's Kevin Durant's, point per possession on a wide open mid-range jumper? It's probably like 1.8%. Like, dude doesn't miss open mid-range jumpers. But if you scheme that up to allow somebody else, a lesser shooter, to have that shot, but you're covering, say, a Kevin Durant caliber shooter on the perimeter, that's by design. And that's a credit to the coaching staff for game to game plan, night to night game planning, but also obviously on the players in terms of execution and the personnel on the floor, the ability to execute what that game plan is. And the Timberwolves this year, if you look at location effective field goal percentage, I talked about this on the offensive side of the ball on Monday's show. Cleaning the glass does the same thing for defense, where it is if in this case the Timberwolves allowed the league average field goal percentage from every location, what would their opponent's effective field goal percentage be? So it takes into account all of the shots the Timberwolves are allowing their opponents to take. So the more mid-range jumpers you allow and the less rim attempts and 3-point and to a lesser extent corner 3-point shots attempted, the better. The Timberwolves were number 4 in the entire league in location effective field goal percentage, which jives with having the number 1 defense in terms of opponent effective field goal percentage. There's not a whole lot of flukiness there. So the opponent expected effective field goal percentage would be 54.6%. Now, they did end up shooting 51.7%, but while there's a little bit of luck there, there's also that other layer I mentioned, which is how are they contesting these shots? So when you have the length of Rudy Gobert at the rim, forcing neverminds where guys are just veering away from the rim because they don't want to do it, or you've got Rudy impacting them at the rim. We'll talk about the Timberwolves' defensive field goal percentage at the rim here in a moment. That is where that gap comes from. That expected effective field goal percentage of 54.6%, and then what actually happened is just 51.7%. So what is that? 2.9%, essentially a 3-point difference. That's the Rudy Gobert impact. And it's also the length of Jaden McDaniels on the perimeter, the length of Nickeil Alexander-Walker, the tenacity and length of Anthony Edwards, the athleticism. All of the above work together to force that field goal percentage down from what's expected to what's actual. And yes, luck can play into that. But when you start with the 4th best opponent shot profile defensively, you don't have to go very far to get the number 1 effective field goal percentage. That is defensive game plan that gets you to number 4, and then it's personnel that gets you the rest of the way to number 1 with a bullet. Easily number 1 in the league in terms of opponent effective field goal percentage. By the way, that is over a point better. The second best mark was Boston, 52.8%. The Wolves were 51.7% opponent effective field goal percentage, 1.1% better than the next best in the league. And 3 0.3% better than league average. Okay. Let's talk about a couple other things they did extremely well, and there were a lot of them, but a couple more things related to location where opponents were getting their shots off. And then we'll talk about some of the light struggles the Timberwolves had, and also how the season wound down against Dallas. We'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at FanDuel. You've heard me talk a lot about FanDuel here at Locked On Wolves, of course, because it's America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we have something a little different for you right now. Now through September 22nd, which is over 3 weeks away, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. NFL starts next Thursday night. There's games Thursday, Friday. Again, the Sunday Ticket is Sunday afternoon games. All you got to do is have that YouTube TV base plan. After you do your 3-week free trial, which again, you get by only betting $5 on something at FanDuel, you'll get that 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Just visit FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. Big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NBA podcast. There's no offseason in the NBA. Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. So opponent shot selection is number one. Forcing the opponent to shoot the shots they want, and then layering in the superior personnel and execution of the guys on the floor. That's exactly what happened. Again, number 1 in the league in opponent effective field goal percentage. They were 4th in expected effective field goal percentage based on location that opponents were shooting their shots. And that was absolutely the, what was number one in terms of what drove opponent scoring down. If you look at frequency, so if we dig into that a layer deeper, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this because obviously this all builds into the number 4 mark there. The Timberwolves were 9th in opponent shot frequency at the rim. So they actually did allow, they were bottom third, or top third still, but toward the end of they were 9th in the league. There were 8 teams that allowed fewer shots at the rim in terms of frequency in the Wolves. The Timberwolves, though, were in the top 3 in terms of mid-range jumpers allowed. No matter where you're looking, short mid-range, which Cleaning the Glass defines as 4 to 14 feet, they were allowed the third most shots from there, the third most shots from long mid-range, and overall the second most mid-range shots, 34.8%. So nearly 35% of opponent shots were coming from mid-range. 3-pointers, they were in the top 10 across the board there too. 9th in corner 3-pointer frequency, 10th in non-corner, and overall 6th in 3-point frequency allowed. So they didn't allow very many threes, and they allowed a ton of mid-range jumpers. And they did a good job at the rim. Not great. But again, that's buoyed by how strong the rim protection was. And that should come as no surprise with the reigning defensive player of the year. Surprisingly, this really did surprise me. Oklahoma City had the best opponent shooting percentage at the rim. And by that, I mean opponent shot the worst against OKC. That really surprised me. Now, the frequency, they were middle of the pack, which means they gave up a lot more points at the rim because they allowed nearly 33% of opponent shots came at the rim. Minnesota was less than 31%. So OKC allowed more shots at the rim. But OKC only allowed opponents to shoot 61.6% at the rim. Minnesota was second best in the league, 62.7%. League average was 66.3%. So Timberwolves were 3.6 points better than the league average in terms of shooting percentage at the rim. That's the Rudy Gobert effect. That is Jaden McDaniels blocking shots from the wing. It's Anthony Edwards chase down blocks. It's, but obviously Rudy Gobert gets the majority of the credit there. The Timberwolves were also 4th in short mid-range jump shot percentage, 2nd in long mid-range jump shot percentage, and 2nd overall in mid-range jump shot percentage. They allowed opponents to shoot just 41% from mid-range. 3-pointers, which again is a little flukier, because you're going to have more open shots from 3 than you're going to have from the mid-range. And also opponents can get open shots in transition. We'll talk about transition defense here in a minute. The Wolves are still top 5 in total opponent 3-point percentage, but they were 15th in corner threes. And I talked about this going into the playoffs, and I was worried about it prior to the Denver series and the Dallas series. It ended up not being a major issue in the Denver series. Obviously, that series went 7 games, but the Wolves won it. But in the Dallas series, corner threes were a major problem. Dallas shot a ton of corner threes last year, and as they remade their roster on the fly, or at least their depth, the Mavs got much better at shooting corner threes, and we'll talk about this in a moment too. They shot threes really well against the Timberwolves, and especially from the corners in the playoffs. And in the regular season, Minnesota was middle of the pack. They were 15th in opponent corner 3-point percentage, 39% opponent shot from the corners. And again, the Wolves were good. They were 9th in the league in corner 3-point frequency, but they allowed a high percentage because so many of those corner threes were uncontested or lightly contested. So that's an area that the Timberwolves will need to clean up, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that here in a moment. The other thing the Wolves did really well, and I touched on this earlier when I was talking 4 factors, was forcing turnovers. Minnesota was 5th in the league in turnover rate. And this didn't look the same early in the season or the year prior. Like the first year of Rudy Gobert, the Wolves didn't force as many turnovers. Remember 3 years ago, when Jared Vanderbilt and Patrick Beverley were on the team, Malik Beasley, there was just a higher level of gambling, of high variance play, of the Wolves were trying to run in transition more offensively, because it was like, hey, we don't have the personnel to stop you defensively, so let's slow you down by trying to get pick sixes and go the other way, play faster, play more possessions. The first year of Rudy Gobert in 22-23, it was a bit of both. And then this last year, the Wolves transitioned to playing much slower overall and having such a good half-court defense. But yet they still force a lot of turnovers. And for as relatively infrequently that the Wolves ran themselves in transition, they actually ran a decent amount off of steals. And this is something else I think they could continue to improve on the offensive side. And I touched on this on Monday's show, is the more opportunities you get in transition, the more high efficiency looks you get, the more easy buckets you get, whether it's open threes, dunks and layups, or getting to the free throw line, right? Transition offense is going to be more efficient naturally. The more turnovers you force, the more of those opportunities you get. And Minnesota was 5th in defensive turnover rate, according to Cleaning the Glass, 14.5%, 0.8 points higher than the league average. And, that's an extra bucket or 2 a game is what that really works out to. And so that was big. And it wasn't like maybe once a game, Anthony Edwards will gamble and give up a butt. We saw that for Team USA in the Olympics, where he gambled a couple of times, gave up open corner threes. That's still an issue occasionally, but this was more staying solid and perimeter defense, pressure at the point of attack, whether it was Mike Conley, Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, and then whoever's not at the point of attack is jumping passing lanes, getting deflections, getting out, running in transition the other way. And that's important. Again, turning defense into offense is super important for a team that struggled at times in the half court last year. But it also, obviously, if you're turning the opponent over, they're not scoring on defense either. So that's huge. Those were the biggest reasons I had was the opponent effective field goal percentage. And then, and also one other thing, the Timberwolves did improve their defense in transition. Remember 2 years ago, they were a miserable defensive team in transition, but they were very good in the half court. That was year 1 of Rudy Gobert. They were not good in transition defensively. This year, they were number 4 in the entire league. Actually, technically, there were 3 teams tied for first. So they actually had the second best mark, but the 4th team, Boston, Oklahoma City, and Houston, were the best in terms of overall transition defense. The Timberwolves were next. 1.8 points per one. Let's see. The way this is framed at Cleaning the Glass is points added per 100 possessions. So how many points did they add per through their transition play? The Timberwolves transition defense was 1.8 per 100 possessions. To give some context, the league worst was 4.3, and that was Utah. League average is 2.7. The Wolves were 1.8. Again, 4th best in the league. Frequency was top 10. Points per play, which is how many points per 100 transition plays, was number 4, 123.8 points per 100 transition plays. Off of steals, they were pretty good. Off of live rebounds, they were great. They got back defensively. The Timberwolves defense in transition was significantly better. So I'll give some additional context. I mentioned they were bad 2 years ago. Let me pull up the exact numbers. So they were 4th in the league last year. You go back to the 22-23 season and look at their defense in transition. In Minnesota was, I'm just waiting for this. Here we go. Minnesota was 18th in the league in transition defense, despite having a borderline top 10. I think they actually were 8th in points per 100 possessions, defensive rating, but they were 18th in transition. They were so good in the half court in year one of Rudy Gobert. Last year, they improved in both areas. And at times, we'll talk about this in a moment, it hurt their defensive rebounding their offensive rebounding, because they were getting back in transition. But grand scheme of things, that helped them because the half court defense was so impressive. All they needed to do was layer in some solid transition defense, force the opponent to slow it down, pull it back out, and then go against the set defense. And game plans of almost every team the Wolves would play against was, let's play fast, let's play fast, let's play fast. Higher variance, more possessions, more opportunities to shoot threes, more chances at offensive rebounds, more times, more opportunities to put pressure on the Timberwolves defense before they can get set. That was the opponent game plan, 9 out of 10 times last year against the Wolves. And Minnesota did a pretty good job of combating that and playing really well in transition. Let's talk about a couple of weak spots for the Wolves defense. Some of these we may dive into a bit deeper here, as we still got, a month left really in the offseason. So, but today I want to touch on a couple of things the Wolves will need to shore up this year. We'll do that here next. Okay, so defensively, we've already established the Timberwolves are the best defense in the league by far. So we're going to nitpick a little bit. First, one of the things that bothered me early in the year that improved as the year went on and ended up actually not being a huge weakness at all was defensive rebounding. Again, they finished 10th in the league, according to Clean the Glass, 8th in the league, according to Basketball Reference, in terms of defensive rebound rate. But they started the year struggling in that regard. And the year prior, they won 42 games in 22-23 and again had a top 10 defense. They were 26th in defensive rebound rate with Rudy Gobert on the roster. Okay, so I don't want to take for granted that last year's defensive rebounding was suddenly like this team is leaps and bounds better. It was a similar roster with Rudy Gobert both years, but they jumped from 26th in the league to 8th, 9th, 10th, somewhere in that range, depending on where you look. Now, the biggest difference was they got rebounding from some other guys. Now, of course, Karl-Anthony Towns also missed 60-plus games in that year when they finished 26th. So they played a little bit smaller. Kyle Anderson played a lot at the 4. That's the biggest difference. But they also had more of a focus on it. Rather than trying to get out and run in transition and play at a high pace, they slowed things down. 2 years ago, they were 7th in pace. Last year, they were 24th in pace. So they sacrificed pace for securing defensive rebounds and making sure that they rewarded themselves for strong defensive possessions by not allowing second chance points. At times, especially early in the season, they had lapses there. But I'll tell you, the biggest differences were a healthy Karl-Anthony Towns and less Kyle Anderson at the 4, and replacing D'Angelo Russell with Mike Conley for a full season. D'Angelo Russell was a horrible defensive rebounder for the Timberwolves. And it was basically a non-factor despite being big, big guard. He just did not put much effort forward when it came to defensive rebounding. I know it feels like not a lot because like Mike Conley's defensive rebound rate was only 9%, but over the course of a season, it matters. If it's one rebound a game, that adds up. That matters. They still need Nas had a much better rebounding year. This was his best rebounding year by far. That's been my biggest knock on Nas going back to, when he was in his first couple years in the league, was for a center. He did not rebound well enough. Now he played less center this year, a lot less center, but his rebound rate was third best on the team behind Rudy and Cat. Ant rebounded the ball well enough. Kyle Anderson wasn't quite what you needed him to be, but they got a lot more out of the guard spots. Monte Morris, Shake Milton, Jordan McLaughlin, Mike Conley, those guys all rebounded better than what D'Lo and other recent point guards did. They could use a little more from Jaden McDaniels and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And that's what's going to take them from 10 to 5. But the consistency of defensive rebounding, if we're nitpicking here, was something that bothered me early last year, and at times they struggle with in the playoffs. Defending without fouling would fall in that same category. They improved dramatically as the year went on, but it occasionally was a problem. Cleaning the Glass had them 15th in opponent free throw rate. Basketball Reference has them 21st. Again, that kind of came and went. And actually, if you look at the playoffs, like the playoff series against Dallas only attempted one more free throw total over the course of the series. Now, part of that is, there's a lot of noise that goes into that overall, but the free throw mark was pretty similar, or free throw, frequency was pretty similar for the two teams within one single free throw. So that wasn't a major issue for the loss. I'd call it a collapse, 5-game loss to Dallas. But that's something that's going to show up in the playoffs too. Can you defend without fouling? Can you be physical without fouling? And it depends on how the game is being officiated. Yes, but that's something the Wolves have continued to improve on and will be key again this year, is defending without fouling. In the playoffs, it was a little bit of that. And a lot of it was what I referenced earlier. The Timberwolves gave up a decent amount of corner threes and a decent amount of open corner threes. That was their Achilles heel during the season, during the regular season, and Dallas took advantage of it. Dallas shoots a lot of corner threes, and they shored up that rotation. They brought in guys who were going to knock them down, and Timberwolves fans, I'm sure all off season, we're seeing, I don't know, like Derek Jones Jr. knocking down those quarter threes and PJ Washington knocking down quarter. PJ Washington didn't even shoot that well against the Wolves in the playoffs. He was like 25% from three, but he hit a couple of big ones. And, those corner threes that were generated from Dallas that were knocked down, Josh Green hit some big threes in limited minutes in that series. Some of these fringe rotation guys that suddenly were important in the playoffs, the Timberwolves allowed those shots after Luka penetration, Kyrie penetration, and the adjustments just weren't fast enough for Minnesota. So it's figuring out a way to X out more aggressively, which at times is very good during the regular season. But again, the corner 3-point frequency for opponents is a little too high. So how can they shore that up? How can they apply the right pressure on ball handlers like Kyrie and big ball handlers like Luka? And overall, I thought they did a pretty good job against Kyrie. I know he scored 27 points a game in the series and shot the ball pretty well. But usually the Wolves can handle small, quick guards like that aren't like, this side of De'Aaron Fox, I guess. But this 31, 32-year-old Kyrie, they can do a decent job against. Luka and his size provided a bigger challenge, and he's the biggest reason why they generated all these open corner threes. And now they add Klay Thompson to the mix in Dallas too, which is just going to add a whole other layer. But all that to say, we're nitpicking. They weren't bottom half of the league in anything except for opponent free throw rate. If you look, depending on where you look, and best case, Cleaning the Glass had him 15th. So 15th in corner threes allowed, 15th in opponent free throw rate, around 10th in terms of opponent defensive. Everything else is top 10. Like, they were really good, buttoned up defensively, no question. It's just a little bit more consistency, defensive rebounding, defending without fouling, defending corner threes. And I think the coaching staff, for as much as I praised them earlier for scheming the defense the way they did to force opponents into tough shots throughout the season, they have to do that in playoff series are all about those game plans and adjusting on the fly, which coaching staff can make the adjustment. I don't think the Wolves coaching staff did a great job with pick and roll coverages against Kyrie and Luka. So that's something to keep an eye on next year. We'll see, not that like all of a sudden they're going to have a solve that they're going to go to all the time in the regular season, but it's something to keep an eye on here as we move forward in this. I don't know. We'll see if Minnesota Dallas becomes something of a rivalry here if Dallas remains as impressive as they were in their run to the finals last year. All right. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back next week. Monday is Labor Day. We will have a show, though, next week. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Still 3 a week. We're only about 3 weeks away from the start of training camp. So we'll dig through some more off-season stuff here in the coming days. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.